Thursday. Chris Brown, Steve Tasker coming to you live from just down the lakeshore as we are sitting, I would say about, what would you call that? About a quarter mile from Cleveland Browns Stadium over our shoulder and the lake right behind the stadium. But the Browns are not long for that stadium, Steve. Well, going to have their brand new joint. What is it, 2031, I want to say, is when that new stadium will be up and running. And it'll be completely enclosed. It'll be an enclosed facility
away from the lake
with a translucent roof. I think it's a glass roof. It's not even translucent. It's like a greenhouse. So
it'll get hot.
Well, hopefully they have climate control.
Yeah, they will, I'm sure.
I would like to think in 2031
nice.
that they do.
It's going to be nice.
Yeah, it'll be nice. Joining us now, as promised, from TSN, football analyst, NFL reporter Dave Naylor. He's been out at Bills camp a few times. We've seen him at the practice facility as well since camp has moved back to One Bills Drive. So, Dave, thanks for joining us. Good to have you on. And we're going to be partners of sorts here as the Bills Radio Network will eventually be airing on TSN in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. So thanks for welcoming us north of the border. We appreciate it, you and your folks.
Yeah, I think it's great. Just a further commitment from TSN to the National Football League and specifically the Buffalo Bills. We are the Canadian rights holder, for all NFL games in this country. And I guess since, really the end of the pandemic, we've kind of refocused our coverage on the Buffalo Bills. I guess since the start of the 22 season, I've been at training camp every year. I'm there every week on Wednesdays. I'm there at the home games. I'm there at the primetime road games. So this is my second kind of go around covering the Bills. I covered the Bills for the Globe and Mail in 08, 09, and 10, which were less fun years to cover the Bills than this era has been, I must say. But it's, there's tremendous interest in the Buffalo Bills in Southern Ontario. You guys know that. You see what the border looks like every Sunday. It's lots of Bills conversations everywhere I go. My own association with the Bills goes back to, it was 1979 when my dad took me to a Bills-Baltimore Colts game in 79. Wow. And, when you're about 13 years old and your dad takes you to your first NFL game, your dad gets informed that that's going to be a yearly thing. This is not a one-off. And I was for my dad and I, all my years growing up. And it's been a real honor to get an opportunity to cover the team and bring stories of the Bills to fans, not just in Southern Ontario, but right across Canada.
What have been the stories that have caught your eye this year?
Well, I was following a lot of the development of Deion Walker. I just think with so many young players, it's really fascinating to me, the defensive side of the ball, because of all the newness, the new coaching staff, Jim Leonard's new scheme, and then so many players that have pretty short NFL resumes that the Bills are counting on this year. And I think when you look to going into camp, there's a risk involved here, right? That you've got players that have got high ceilings, but you don't really know how they're going to adapt and they don't know what they're going to be ready for. But Deion Walker has really emerged. A couple of interesting comments, yesterday just after practice, hearing Bradley Chubb say he's the biggest light-footed dude I've ever seen in my life, which was a great description for a guy who's, 6'7", 330, and just 22 years of age. I think that's the other thing that really intrigues about him. When you see, there are guys coming out of the draft now who are, 24, 25 years of age. So he's 3 years younger than some rookies are going to be this season. For instance, Akeem Messidor, who went out of the draft this year, I covered pretty extensively, a kid out of Canada. He's 25 years old playing for the Chargers, their first round pick. And just talking to Maxwell Hairston a little bit about, what he saw with him in Kentucky. And he said, the guy you guys saw in the preseason game on Saturday, that's Kentucky Deion. That's one that's grabbed my eye. I'm also interested in Caleb El-Armzour, kind of seeing more of him. You could certainly presence. I don't know if he really flashed in that preseason game, but you could certainly see, his physical presence and just his speed to the ball and those kinds of things. And I thought it was interesting that Jim Leonard kind of unprompted at his availability before practice on Tuesday, kind of declared that that's a competition between him and Dorian Williams. There's an opportunity for a rookie to grab a starting job. So those are a few of the guys that have sort of just, jumped out at me. Obviously the DJ Moore thing has just been impressive. Like every time you see the ball going, the speed, the yards after catch, all of that, I think we're all excited. And I was talking to Dawson Knox about this last week, and he was just talking about how much he thinks DJ Moore is going to unlock for everybody else on that offense. And then talked also about how well he's fit in, among the receiver group, among the offensive skill players off the field as well, which I think is important. The Bills have always been a tight group. I always feel like covering the Bills, that's been an advantage for them. I always remember like Joey Bosa saying at camp last year, something to the effect of, I've gone out more times with my teammates here, than I did in whatever number of years it was. And just kind of that kind of, I think that stuff matters, and I think it's something that the Bills have kind of built into their culture. And it seems like DJ Moore has kind of bought into that as well.
Yeah, I want to touch on what you talked about with the youth on the defensive side of the ball, because we're still waiting to see just exactly how different everything does look with all the newness that you mentioned. But the one thing that we know will definitively be different is the philosophical shift from McDermott, who would tend to cling to veteran players and not put younger guys on the field that might not be quite ready in his estimation, even in the playoffs, where we would see him pull, A.J. Klein off a couch to play in a playoff game for him rather than a young player that had been there all season. And now under Joe Brady, who's young himself as the youngest head coach in the league, this complete philosophical shift to youth and athleticism, particularly on that defensive side of the ball. We know unequivocally it's going to be different from that perspective. What have you seen, and what do you expect from this new influx of youth that is going to permeate the defensive lineup?
Well, I think already we can kind of see more speed and athleticism, on that defense already. And you're right. When you think about the McDermott and the, all the guys that were brought back, that he felt safe with, and I think it's been well noted that, a lot of the guys that played meaningful snaps on that defense last year as veterans aren't anywhere in the National Football League right now, which is kind of a suggestion that they may have been back past their best before date, during much of last season. But I think, and I'm always interested when people say things kind of at the podium as well, when it's unprompted, right? They're not asked about it. They go there and bring it up. And Jim Leonard did that last week at one of his availabilities, where he talked about, like just tackling being he called it an Achilles heel. I'm sure you guys have discussed this, called it an Achilles heel, and talked about, wanting to see, multiple bodies getting to the football. Well, what is that? That's athleticism. That's quickness. That's physicality. That's all those things that you get, I think, when you go younger on defense. You may get more mistakes. You may get missed assignments. There's going to be, that's just the nature of inexperience, of the lack of experience in football, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, where you're reacting to things you see and maybe things you haven't seen before. But I think when you get that, you do get that traffic fly into the football, that athleticism, that quickness. And I think that's really, you bring up a great point, Chris, because you've got two sort of philosophical shifts going on the defensive side of the ball. You've got the scheme, which is very different in what it's meant to do and what it's meant to protect and defend, different than what McDermott had. And then it's just, you've got all this new blood, all this athleticism. Now they brought in some veteran presence in Greg Gaines, who is a guy who, based on his resume and the Bills' kind of lack of experience in that defensive front group, you figure he's got an opportunity to play, some pretty meaningful football for the Bills. So he balances that out. And I think there was maybe some sense when they went to camp that you might see a mid-August addition to that group just because of its youth. But I think it's clear the Bills are gonna ride with this, and that's easy to do if you were 5-13 last year, and everyone's just looking for you to go 9-8 and maybe challenge for the playoffs. But the expectations around this team haven't changed at all. It's just the method by which they're going to try to get there has.
What are you looking for in this Browns preseason game?
Well, I would say, I'd look for some players that maybe got to show a little more. Maybe like maybe a Dwayne Carter. I mean, I mentioned the Greg Gaines signing. I mean, I would think that's not great news for him. You know, it's a backup in that role. Again, I'm not 100% sure on how they're going to deem who's going to play. I assume a lot of the starters are not going to play, but I'd like to see Joshua Palmer, you know, flash a little bit. I think he was a big disappointment certainly last year just because he was never healthy. And I talked to him in camp early in camp about, you know, that play in Atlanta. I was there at that game where, you know, he said he suffered 3 injuries on one play. I think it was hip, knee, and ankle all on one play. And the difficulty of trying to rehab 3 injuries at once, because of course, when you're favoring one, you're affecting the other. He just never became 100%. And, you know, I think it was a significant addition. I mean, basically the only significant addition to the offense, and just didn't get to shine the way he did. And I know he's been a battle with Keon Coleman for play time at that number 3 receiver role. Preseason game, Keon goes out, 3 catches on 4 targets, scores the first preseason touchdown at Highmark. And Josh Palmer didn't have a target. So, you know, he's a guy I would certainly, you know, love to see him sort of get into some rhythm. You know, I'm sure it would be good for his confidence. Saw him make a big catch there at the open practice on Tuesday along the sidelines when the Bills were in 2-minute drill. But, you know, he's a guy I'm sure very much wants to be a more significant contributor, and maybe we'll see some of that if he gets an opportunity in the preseason game at Cleveland. But he's certainly a guy, yeah, I'd like to see some from it for sure.
Then last one for me, Dave, like what young player, maybe besides some of the obvious, like, you know, you already mentioned Caleb Elarms and a couple of others, but what young player that maybe you weren't expecting a lot from has kind of caught your eye and you're interested to see more from before this preseason is over?
Well, I'm going to go with Landon Jackson. I know he's not a rookie. I don't know if you were meaning rookie specifically, but I think
not rookie
he looks like the guy who maybe can make the greatest year 1, year 2 jump. And I know a lot of people talk about that in the NFL, that, you know, that's the expectation, is that guys are going to make a significant jump from year 1 to year 2 because everything's not new. They've actually had an off season. I mean, the point is when you're a college player and you finish your college season in December or January, and, you know, you go through the college bowl games and the pro visits and the combine and, you know, everything, it's a really, you know, you're taking in a lot before you get to your first NFL season. And it just felt like in Landon Jackson's case, you know, he was, I think, going to a different scheme than he played in college. It was certainly, he's bulked up. You can see that this camp just seems to be kind of a more confident player. You know, got some, certainly, I believe he was with the starters in that preseason game on Saturday. So, you know, I think those are the kind of players that may be disappointed in year number 1 that you're looking to get something out of in year number 2. And, you know, from what I understand, you know, he's talked about this scheme being, you know, a lot more sort of befitting his skill set. And when you combine that with bulking up, hopefully be able to get through a healthy season, you know, there's a guy who, you know, again, you're very young up front, but there's not a lot of time for development in the National Football League. You know, when you're a decent mid-high round pick and, you know, your rookie year wasn't great, the expectation is you're going to take a great leap forward in year number 2. And Landon Jackson is a guy who's caught my eye, and I might expect that from this season.
Nice to see it on Saturday. Thanks for joining us, Dave. It's great talking to you. We'll have you on again sometime.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Great to join you.